In 1882, deep in the Tennessee hills, a widow rose from poverty to sudden wealth. But neighbors soon whispered that her fortune was bought with something far darker than gold, flesh itself. Tonight, we uncover a tale so grim it was buried as Forbidden's history. If you enjoy uncovering history's secrets, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell icon so you never miss a journey into the past. The year was 1882, and the Tennessee hills were a place where silence carried more than the sound of cicadas. It carried secrets. The land itself was tired fields once thick with corn and tobacco, now lay ragged, eroded by years of overwork and neglect. Families scraped by, clinging to what little remained after the Civil War had chewed through men, land, and spirit. The air was heavy with superstition, for when poverty deepened, faith in Scripture often walked hand in hand with fear of the supernatural dot in the scattered cabins dotting the hills. Nights were long and unkind. Folks spoke in whispers about signs and omens. A crow lingering too long on a fence post. A lantern seen moving through the woods when no man should be out. And above all, the belief that certain people had found ways to prosper when no one else could, and that such prosperity could not come without a cost. It was here, tucked away in a weathered farmhouse at the edge of a pine thicket, that Martha Keaton, a widow of 43, lived alone. Her husband, Thomas, had been lowered into the ground just the year before. Some said after a long illness. Others muttered after a sudden accident that no doctor ever examined too closely. Whatever the truth, the land that should have swallowed her whole in grief and poverty did no such thing. For while her neighbors struggled with bare cupboards and starving livestock, Martha seemed untouched. Her smokehouse never emptied. Her dresses, though plain, were of finer cloth than most around her. And curiously, she had begun to purchase small parcels of adjoining land. The widow was not just surviving. She was thriving. Yet in those hills, success was its own kind of curse. It drew attention. It stirred jealousy. And it birthed suspicion, whispered late at night across cabin firesides. How does a lone widow, with no sons and no kin, keep herself fed so well? What's she trading out of that smokehouse of hers? The Tennessee hills of 1882 were no place for miracles. And when miracles appeared, people looked for the devil hiding behind them. At first, the townsfolk were cautious in their whispers. A woman left alone in the Tennessee hills was pitied, sometimes pitied enough to be left unbothered. But as weeks turned into months, pity curdled into unease. Martha Keaton's name was often the last thing spoken before candles were snuffed out at night. Men returning from long days in the fields wondered aloud why she never seemed to struggle with her harvest. Women, worn thin from rationing scraps for their children, noted the fullness of her figure and the fabric of her gowns. And children, sharp-eyed and loose-tongued, spoke of strange wagons that came down her lane after sunset, their wheels muffled with cloth, their lanterns dimmed as though they carried secrets rather than supplies. Her smokehouse became the centerpiece of rumor. To pass by on a warm day was to be met with the pungent aroma of salted meat, rich and thick, yet wrong. It was not the scent of pork or venison, but something heavier, metallic, lingering on the tongue like rust. Neighbors asked polite questions at first. "Martha, you've been keeping busy with that smokehouse. Did you get a hog from the Thompsons?" "No," she replied simply, her voice low and steady, never offering more than needed. "Strange, then, how your racks stay so full. We've not seen you at the market with the butchers." Her only answer was a measured smile. As the months passed, those smiles became less reassuring and more unsettling. People began to avoid her road unless necessity forced them. Children dared each other to run up and touch the door of her smokehouse, swearing they heard something shift inside, something that wasn't pig. Yet with every whisper came another undeniable fact. Martha was growing wealthier. She bought 2 new mules, livestock stronger than any in the county. She acquired land 1 acre here, another there paying in coin rather than barter, which was almost unheard of. In a community where families still haggled over bolts of cloth and sacks of cornmeal, she carried silver dollars that shone like they'd never seen daylight. Some speculated she had inherited hidden savings from her late husband, but those who'd known Thomas Keaton laughed at the thought. He had died in debt, owing more to his neighbors than he ever gave back. There had been no savings, no hidden chest. The conclusion, spoken carefully in church pews and around cracked dinner tables, was simple. The widow's wealth came from a source unholy. Some claimed she'd made a pact with the traveling peddlers who roamed the back roads, trading more than quilts and preserves. Others swore they had seen her standing in the thicket at night, whispering into the trees, her face illuminated by the soft glow of a lantern, as if waiting for someone or something to answer. But the most persistent rumor, the one that grew roots in the minds of the villagers, was this: Martha Keaton was trading flesh. Flesh not from livestock, but from the drifters, the desperate, the forgotten dot, and though no one dared to confront her directly, all agreed on one thing: prosperity never came without a price. The true nature of the widow's fortune, as the hills would later whisper, began the night she buried her husband. Thomas Keaton's grave was shallow, dug by neighbors too weary to linger. The service was quick hushed, for a storm gathered over the ridge. When the last hymn faded, the mourners hurried home, leaving Martha alone with the fresh mound of earth. Rain threatened, the wind hissed through the pines, and she stood there long after the lanterns disappeared into the dark. That was the night she made her bargain. Some said it was with a passing trader, one of those gaunt men who rode from hollow to hollow, selling elixirs and charms out of battered wagons. Others insisted it was no man at all, but something far older, a shadow that had waited in those woods for a desperate soul. What is certain is that Martha was never seen praying at her husband's grave. Instead, she was seen carrying something wrapped in cloth to her smokehouse, her eyes fixed, her face hard. Weeks later, the first drifter vanished. He was a young man from Kentucky, passing through in search of work. He asked at the tavern for directions toward the mines, but never arrived. A month after, a tinker woman disappeared, last seen selling needles and tin cups along the ridge road. No bodies were found, but Martha's smokehouse grew full, and her purse grew heavy. The whispers turned sharper. Her smokehouse is her altar. The widow don't salt pork, she salts people. She's trading flesh for fortune, and the devil himself is her butcher. Some spoke of hearing faint cries carried on the wind from her farm at night, muffled by thick wooden walls. Others swore they saw smoke rise at odd hours, though no cooking fires burned in time. Even her purchases seemed marked by the bargain. When she paid for land with silver coins, some claimed the coins felt warm to the touch, as though fresh from a furnace. When she bought her new mules, the animals refused to cross her threshold at first, braying and pulling against their reins. The tale deepened. Her wealth was no mere luck. It was bought with flesh. She gave over what the land would not provide, meat that did not come from swine or deer. And in return, the hills themselves, or the dark thing dwelling within them, saw to it that she never wanted. The Keaton farm became both feared and avoided. Strangers traveling through Tennessee were warned. If the widow offers you food, don't take it. And if she offers you work, don't follow her home. Her bargain, though never written in any ledger, was carved into the memory of the hills. A pact of hunger, coin, and flesh, and the neighbors, too afraid to confront her, too bound by their own poverty to risk losing the trade she brought, chose silence. For silence, too, can be its own kind of bargain. By the winter of 1882, the Tennessee hills were restless. Too many people had vanished without a trace. A farmhand traveling home to his mother never arrived. A pair of orphans bound for a mission school simply disappeared between towns. And though the roads were dangerous in those days, every set of missing footsteps seemed to lead back toward the widow's lane. Neighbors grew uneasy, torn between suspicion and fear. Few dared speak openly, for to accuse a woman of such horrors was no small matter. Yet the air was thick with dread, and the rumors were becoming impossible to ignore. It was the pastor, Reverend Harlan, who finally gave voice to what others only muttered. From his pulpit, with his congregation hushed and sweating in the dim light, he declared, "The Lord's flock is being thinned not by wolves of the forest, but by wolves in our midst. Beware the smoke that rises when no hog has been slaughtered. Beware the bread that tastes of ash." Though he never named her outright, every ear knew who he meant. Eyes darted toward the widow's pew, where Martha sat straight-backed, her face pale but unflinching. The sermon lit a fire. Within days, a handful of men farmers, hunters, and grieving fathers resolved to test the truth of the rumors. They waited for nightfall, when the hills grew still and the smokehouse lantern burned low. Lanterns in hand, shotguns slung across shoulders, they walked Martha Keaton's lane, their boots sinking into the cold mud. The first sign was the smell. It rolled heavy through the night air, thick and coppery, unlike any butcher's smoke. The men gagged, yet pressed on, for the stench was proof enough that something foul awaited. When they reached the smokehouse, they found the door bolted from within. One man swore he heard a muffled thump, like something shifting against the planks. Another muttered a prayer and forced the lock with his axe. The door creaked open, and what met them was worse than any rumor. Inside, racks of salted meat hung in long strips, pale and slick in the lantern light. Bones jutted from barrels filled with brine. Among the piles of burlap sacks, they found a child's shoe, stained dark at the heel. In the corner, tucked under old cloth, lay belongings recognized by the men: a workman's belt buckle, a tinker's satchel, a drifter's hat. One man swore later that he saw a face half cured, half decayed, staring back at him from the hooks. Whether truth or madness, the discovery was enough. They stumbled out into the night, their lanterns shaking, their hearts hammering in their throats, and as they turned back toward the farmhouse, they saw her. Martha Keaton stood in the doorway, calm as a woman greeting guests, her dress spotless, her hands folded neatly before her. She did not flee. She did not speak. She only stared, as though daring them to name her crime aloud. The silence stretched until one of the men whispered, "God forgive us." The bargain is real. From that night, the truth could no longer be hidden. But whether justice would follow, that was another matter entirely. The morning after the smokehouse was forced open, the hills buzzed with fear and outrage. Word spread faster than fire on dry pine. Every cabin, every church pew, every whisper at the market carried the same dreadful truth. The widow's bargain had been uncovered, but in the Tennessee hills of 1882, justice was not straightforward. Lawmen were scarce, and courts were distant. What mattered most was the will of the community and the weight of silence that powerful men preferred to keep. A group of farmers and townsmen gathered at dawn to seize her. They found Martha Keaton at her table, calmly drinking chicory coffee as though nothing had changed. The door stood open, and when the men entered, she did not protest. "You've seen what you wanted," she said quietly, "but you've not seen what you've taken from me." The words unsettled them, though they didn't yet know why. Bound with rope, she was led from her farmhouse, past the smokehouse with its bolted door. Neighbors who had once pitied or envied her now turned away, unwilling to meet her eyes. Children clutched their mothers' skirts, whispering that the widow had the devil in her pocket. Some demanded a swift hanging. Others argued for a trial in town. A few, uneasy with what had been found, urged silence. Best to bury it before it buries us all. For if it was true that Martha had trafficked flesh, then who had purchased it? Who had tasted it without knowing? Here the tale splinters. One account claims she was tried in secret. A gathering of elders and churchmen convened in a barn by lantern light. They listened to testimonies of missing sons and missing daughters. They held up the shoe, the buckle, the satchel as evidence. By dawn, the verdict was death. She was hanged in the grove by the river, her body left unmarked, her grave unrecorded. Another version tells of her vanishing. On the night before her supposed trial, the guards awoke to find the ropes cut, the door ajar, her bed empty. Tracks led into the thicket, but ended in soft earth, as if she had stepped off the world itself. Some swore she was spirited away by those who had shared her wealth-men, too frightened of exposure to let her speak. Others whispered she returned to the woods, to the shadow with whom she had struck her bargain. And in the darkest telling, she was never tried, never punished. Instead, the townsfolk struck a deal of their own quietly sharing in her stores of meat, taking coin for their silence, complicit in the widow's grisly trade. That version is spoken only in hushed tones, for it condemns not just her, but the whole community. Whatever the truth, the records are absent. No court ledger bears her name. No church register marks her burial. The official histories of the county glide over the winter of 1882, as if nothing happened at all. But in the hills, memory lingers longer than ink. The reckoning, whatever form it took, was never written down because it was too monstrous to endure. Daylight. And so Martha Keaton became both ghost and warning, a tale told at cabin, firesides to remind children that bargains made in desperation always come. When the smokehouse was emptied and the Kawata widow's fate decided, whether by rope, by vanishing, or by quiet complicity, the Tennessee hills turned to the business of forgetting. The newspapers, so quick to trumpet every petty theft and fire, carried nothing of Martha Keaton. One county sheet printed a single paragraph about a domestic disturbance, but the issue was recalled the next morning, as though ink itself refused to hold the truth. Other presses never touched the story at all. The silence was deliberate, for silence can be arranged. Families of the missing were urged to move on by men in authority. Some were given coins, others parcels of land, as though grief could be purchased. When one grieving father demanded that a circuit judge investigate, his farm mysteriously burned to the ground within the month. He never raised the subject again. Church records tell their own tale of suppression. Reverend Harlan, who had once thundered warnings from the pulpit, later scribbled a single cryptic line in the back of his ledger. The widow's smokehouse emptied, but the hunger lingers. No births, no deaths, no excommunications were entered for nearly a year afterward. The pages stand blank, as if even God's house had agreed to cover its eyes. Neighbors adopted a simple rule: never speak her name. To do so was to invite unease, or worse, suspicion. If a child asked why the Keaton farm stood empty, they were hushed with the old mountain phrase, "Some land ain't meant for planting," yet secrets rot as surely as flesh. Travelers moving through the hills began to hear fragments of the tale at taverns, in hunting camps, at the edges of firelight. Most were dismissed as drunken invention, but every so often someone carried the story further downriver, into towns and cities where people would shake their heads and call it nothing but hill folk superstition. Still, the local folk knew better. They had seen the racks of meat. They had smelled the copper town of the smokehouse. They had watched a widow grow rich when no one else could. So the tale lived on, not in ink, but in whisper, traded like contraband between generations. A banned story too ugly for the page, too dangerous for the pulpit, yet too true to vanish. In time, the Keaton farm fell into ruin. The barn collapsed, the fields grew wild, and the smokehouse door sagged on its hinges. But no one claimed the land. No one rebuilt. The very soil seemed tainted, as though it remembered what the people tried so hard to erase. And perhaps that was the final bargain. The community gave the widow to silence, and in return, silence gave them peace. But peace, like all bargains, never lasts. The years rolled on, but the hills never let go of the widow's bargain. Where history books fell silent, folklore stepped in. And in those hills, folklore had longer teeth than fact dot by the early 1900s. Hunters and wanderers reported strange happenings near the old Keaton place. Some claimed their dogs refused to track through the thicket, whining and pulling away as if the ground itself reeked of fear. Others told of finding bones scattered in the soil, some animal, some not so easily explained. The bones were always brittle, blackened, as though touched by fire that never cooled. Children of the hills were warned to stay away from the ruins. Mothers told them, "If you hear the wind whistle through the smokehouse door, don't answer. It's her, still calling." Teenagers, daring one another on moonlit nights, spoke of seeing a pale figure at the window of the collapsed farmhouse. She never moved, never blinked, just stood with folded hands, watching. Even today, hikers who stumble across the site describe the same unease. The woods grow unnaturally quiet there, as though birds and insects alike had struck a pact to keep their distance. Some speak of the sudden drop in temperature, the way breath fogs the air, even in summer heat. Others claim they found carvings in the nearby pines, strange tally marks, uneven and jagged, as if someone were keeping count of debts that had not yet been paid. Locals in the Tennessee hills rarely speak her name, but they do share a single saying, passed down like a family heirloom. Fortune bought with flesh will always demand more. It is both warning and reminder. A way to explain misfortunes, a way to frighten children, and perhaps a way to keep the memory of Martha Keaton alive, even when ink and law conspired to erase her. Whether she was truly hanged, vanished, or shielded by those complicit in her wealth no longer matters. What matters is that her story lingers where others fade, like smoke that clings to a house long after the fire is gone. And so the widow remains an echo, a shadow, a caution whispered by firelight. The band story of the Tennessee hills.